First speaker is Professor Ora Schwarzwald, who is Professor Emerita and linguist from Department of Hebrew and Semitic Languages at Bar Ilan University. She also teaches in the Salty Center for Ladino Studies. She's a member of the Academy of the Hebrew Language, associate member of the Spanish Royal Academy, and she won the 2015 Landau Prize for her research on Ladino. She will talk on the status of 16th century Jewish women in the Ottoman Empire according to Seder Nashim and Shulḥan Hapanim in Ladino. Professor Schwarzwald.
And thanks for the organization, which is excellent so far. Great. I have no handout and have no PowerPoint presentation. I'll just talk. Okay. The introductions of two Ladino books written in Saloniki by Rabbi Meir ben Shmuel Benvenisti around the middle of the 16th century provide a number of insights regarding the status of Sephardic Jewish women residing in the Ottoman Empire at that time. The first, Seder Nashim, a prayer book for women written in Ladino circa 1565, includes numerous instructions for proper conduct in addition to the prayers. The second book, Shulḥan Hapanim, Mesa del Alma in Ladino, is an edited Ladino translation of Shulchan Aruch by Rabbi Yosef Karo, which was published circa 1568. Although the regulations regarding women's behavior presented in both books are based on older traditional Jewish sources, such as the Talmud and earlier interpretations of Jewish law, the status of women in society and their functions are revealed to us through the introductions and special instructions which appear in both works. The author himself is very much in favor of women's education, but he paints a picture of an era in which Jewish women were mostly illiterate and had very little knowledge of Hebrew or of Jewish law. The paper will focus on the status of Jewish women in the Ottoman Empire and will conclude by comparing this status with that of Jewish women living in the Iberian Peninsula in the years prior to the Spanish expulsion and in other diaspora communities, in addition to commenting on the status of Sephardic women in subsequent years. I'll start with Seder Nashim. You'll see probably tomorrow at the visit, in the visit of the National Library, you'll see the Sidur. It's a small book, contains a lot. The title page describes the contents of the book very concisely. Seder Nashim includes prayers for the whole year, blessings, Birchot HaNehenim, which are listed towards the end of the book, and various laws that concern different aspects of Jewish life. Right from the beginning, the author stresses that all the blessings and instructions are written in Ladino. The title page also mentions that Hebrew alphabet, together with the vowel system, is included at the end of the book for the purpose of facilitating reading, but unfortunately, these last pages have been lost. The fact that the title page references the inclusion of an alphabet demonstrates that women needed to be instructed how to read. The statement specifically specifying that the book is written in Ladino suggests that the reader would not have been very familiar with any other language. Seder Nashim contains two almost identical introductions, one in Hebrew, written in Rashi script, and another one in Ladino, presented in square vocalized Hebrew letters. These introductions were meant to be read by the general public, not necessarily by the women. Benveniste begins the introduction of the book by advocating that every Jewish man should be responsible for all members of his family in regard to their observance of Jewish law, based on Maimonides. He laments that although all daughters of Israel are obliged to say their prayers and Birchot HaNehenim, the community members do not teach these things, so that women believe that they are totally exempt from reciting prayers and blessings. Benveniste gives two suggestions as to why men disregard the requirement to teach women their religious obligations. 1, it will take women a long time to learn how to read. 2, if women devote too much time to reciting prayers and blessings, they might neglect their small children. These suggestions demonstrate that not only did women not know how to read, but also that they were not accustomed to praying or reciting blessings. Moreover, men refrained from teaching women to read because they believed that they were incapable of learning, and that in any case the time spent studying, reading, and reciting prayers and blessings might infringe on their domestic duties. Benveniste contradicts these assertions by claiming that women were not obliged to recite as many prayers or fulfill as many commandments as men. Furthermore, since prayers can be said in the language with which one is familiar, Ladino, women will understand what they're saying, and learning to read will be easy for them. He does not teach Hebrew prayers, but rather translate them into Ladino, the spoken language of his readers. He specifies that he has only included the prayers and blessings that women must say. Benveniste asserts that he began preparing the prayer book in order to help the women in his household. Subsequently, community members urged him to publish the book for the benefit of others. In the Ladino introduction, he even advised that every evening a man can teach his daughter a part of the prayer book. Another introduction at the beginning of the Siddur itself is addressed to women. This includes general instructions regarding conduct during prayer and repeats some of the assertions mentioned above. However, he also specifies that it is entirely permissible for any woman who is knowledgeable to pray more than the minimum required of her. Apparently, there must have been a few women at that time who were fully literate and who could perhaps even read Hebrew. Throughout the book, Benveniste instructs women on how and when to pray, what to do if they occasionally forgot to say their prayers, and other such relevant information. As far as he is concerned, women can perform a great number of religious duties themselves. For instance, leading a Passover Seder for women, putting the mezuzah, making a ma'akeh, a fence around the roof. Special attention is given to the traditional female duties, such as those relating to the Shabbat laws, challah, separating the dough, and tevilah, the ritual bath. Husbands, fathers, male teachers, and rabbis are hardly mentioned in the book. Woman is entirely autonomous and can perform all Jewish rituals by herself if she follows the instructions given in that Siddur. According to this Seder Nashim, female living in the 16th century Ottoman Empire only spoke Ladino. Benvenisti hoped his book would improve the status of women who were mostly illiterate and ignorant of most Jewish law, prayers and blessings. As the book was only meant for domestic use, it is understood that women did not get out of the house much. Now, Shulḥan Hapanim. The title page of Shulḥan Hapanim states that it is translated into Ladino from Shulchan Aruch for the benefit of the people. The book contains all the laws that every Jew is commanded to uphold so that he can learn them and in turn teaches them to the members of his household. As in Seder Nashim, Benvenisti states that this book was written using square script with vowels so that everyone can read and there will be no ignorant men among the Jews. Although the title page does not specifically mention women, they may be implied from the use of las personas de su casa, the people of his house, including women. Once again, Benvenisti includes two introductions in the book, one in Rashi script and another in Ladino. Most of the Hebrew introduction is devoted to explaining why the author has decided to write the book in Ladino. He has translated the book because the public understands his own language, Ladino, much better than Hebrew. He states the principles that he established for the purpose of his translation. In this introduction, he forbids anyone from ever publishing the book in Italy or in Latin letters because censors might change its contents. The Ladino introduction is more detailed than the Hebrew one, and women are mentioned several times. It begins by explaining that the author decided to write the book in Ladino using square vocalized letters in order to make it easier to understand. Regarding women, Benvenisti claims the following. Women should be careful regarding the laws of Nida, Chala, and lighting Shabbat candles, as well as other laws of kashrut. The reason for being so cautious about kashrut is that it is the wife's role to prepare food, and if she is not careful, her husband will be blamed. The author adds that a man should not satisfy himself by assuming that all women are knowledgeable about these Jewish laws, since a great negligence exists. Although Benvenisti warns men that they must teach women certain Jewish religious laws, it is apparent that from his own words that they already trusted women in these matters, probably because customs were traditionally handed down from mother to daughter. Benvenisti continues by emphasizing that men should be specifically careful to read the laws regarding every festival before its time in order to teach women about necessary preparations. The author also writes that it would be expedient for every father to at least teach his daughter how to read and write so that she could read the book by herself. Fathers also need to teach their daughter how to say the daily prayers and how to recite blessings, Birchot HaNe'enim. And as in Seder Nashim, he mentions that women are not obliged to recite very many prayers, and that as these can be said in Ladino, this will not interfere with their taking care of children. Benvenisti reminds his readers of the book that he previously written, Seder Nashim, the one I discussed before, that contains all the laws women need to know in order to live proper Jewish life. Benvenisti also adds that if more complex question arises, one should contact a rabbi, Chacham in Ladino. The author then repeats the warning not to publish the book in Italy. And he adds at the end, and if anybody can understand Hebrew, he better use Shulḥan Aruch, the original, and not his book. Of the 3.25-page Ladino introduction, more than a third is devoted to women, to the instructions about women. The introductions of the two books demonstrate that Jewish women in the 16th century Ottoman Empire were largely illiterate, although the inner introduction of Seder Nashim hints that some women knew to read. The necessity of learning to read and write is emphasized over and over again. It seems that most women did not have these basic skills. Although very little is known about girls' education in other diaspora communities at that time, it would appear that the literacy rate in Ashkenazi Jewish women Ashkenazi Jewish women would have been higher than that of their Sephardic contemporaries. A significant number of publications aimed at European Yiddish-speaking female audiences were published at that time and later, suggesting that the Hebrew alphabet was known and that many women could read Yiddish and perhaps also Hebrew. Books and manuscripts published in Yiddish from this era on include translation of the Pentateuch, the scrolls, as well as translations of prayer books, selichot, halachot, and also some fictional secular literature. It is clear, however, that extensive knowledge of Hebrew was limited in both diaspora communities. Although many women prayer books were published in Yiddish during the 18th and 19th century, these were apparently used by men who were not familiar with the Hebrew language. Prayer books and other religious texts were also published in Judeo-Italian in Italy using Hebrew script, and a few of which were meant to be used exclusively by women. This indicates that at least some women in Italy were acquainted with the Hebrew alphabet and would have been able to read Judeo-Italian text as well as a short Hebrew or Judeo-Italian techinot. However, it is unclear if all women in these communities were literate or just a small minority of learned and probably rich individuals. The status of Jewish women in the Ottoman Empire during the 16th century mirrored that of the same community in medieval Spain, where lifestyles had been heavily influenced by Islamic culture and ancient Jewish halachic ruling. Most women were illiterate, and only those who were lucky enough to come from rich and educated families would have learned to read and write. Most women rarely left their homes and lived under the strict control of their fathers and husbands. A minority of women who owned their own property or helped their husbands in business were also active outside the house, although they would be preferably accompanied by a male companion. The fact that the prayers and blessings were absent from the lives of most Sephardic Jewish women clearly troubled Rabbi Benvenisti. This is the reason why he published Seder Nashim and why he gives detailed guidelines in both books. In Seder Nashim, he also gives detailed instructions regarding washing hands, where and when to pray, the Shabbat and holiday laws, and so on. Seder Nashim functions as an abbreviated version of Shulchan Aruch, which is limited to the relevant laws that women are required to adhere to. Despite all this, he claims that if women follow his book, they can be autonomous in every act in Jewish life. Despite all this relative freedom, however, a woman still had a specific role to play at home. This is the reason why there is no mention in the Siddur of the Kaddish, reading the Torah, or Kedushat Keter, which is recited in synagogue or on the Sabbath. Shulchan Hapanim was published for the second time in 1602 and once again in 1713, on both occasions in Venice, Italy, despite the author's specific written objection. In 1602 edition, the copy is exactly like the original version. The 1713 is slightly edited. Seder Nashim was never printed again, and no other prayer books exclusively designed for the use of women was ever published in the Ottoman Empire for the Sephardic women. Rabbi Benvenisti's efforts to educate Jewish women were certainly not fulfilled. Despite his own open mind, traditional conservative male attitudes towards women praying and fulfilling additional religious duties prevailed, and women stopped using prayer books written exclusively for them. Women gradually became increasingly ignorant of the Jewish law and ritual practices presented so meticulously in Benvenisti's Siddur. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Michal Ben Yaakov. Professor Ben Yaakov is an associate professor at history at the Efrat School of Education in Jerusalem and director of graduate program in memory heritage and education. Her research focuses on 19th and 20th century Eretz Israel, with special emphasis on North African and Sephardi Jewry. She has lectured widely in Israel and abroad, published numerous articles, and edited 3 conferences volumes. Professor Ben Yaakov.
זה קדימה.
זה יעלה עוד שנייה.
אבל רק...
את יכולה להתחיל.
אוקיי, טוב. In Morocco, as in other countries of the diaspora in Eretz Israel, Jewish women living in traditional societies accepted the religious norms of their communities, dominated by the rabbinical and lay male leadership. However, while seemingly acquiescing, women simultaneously sought to expand upon the boundaries of these same cultural norms and form some spheres meaningful to them, and in some cases significantly transforming them, in order to express their own spirituality and aspirations. As women of other locales, ethnicities, and religious groups, they often adapted practices assumed to be accepted and molded them for their own benefit, navigating their way around cultural expectations, negotiating relationships with their family and community, and maneuvering to empower themselves, consciously, subconsciously, or unconsciously, directly, indirectly, or surreptitiously. Geographic transitions are particularly relevant to examine the cultural capital of Jewish women in Morocco and the land of Israel, as both space and place are simultaneously physical and social constructs, intricately woven together, constantly being formed and reformed in traditional society as in modern. This presentation will focus on the cultural resources within Jewish tradition from which women drew, while negotiating and transforming aspects of gender roles and geographical mobility, expanding the spatial norms of behavior in Jewish tradition beyond the recognized boundaries of social convention, and increasing their mobility in both geographic and social spheres, while still remaining firmly within Jewish traditional society. I will focus on the activities of widows, a particular group of Jewish women who were able to take advantage of their marginalized position in traditional society to further expand boundaries circumscribed by gender and to empower themselves and, in fact, create new models for other women. I will restrict my brief presentation here to two specific forms of spatial mobility within Moroccan religious life, which became increasingly dominated by women's participation during the 19th and early 20th century. That of saint veneration, Aratzat Tzadikim, with visits to the graves of holy men in both Morocco and Eretz Yisrael, and Aliyah, the immigration to the Holy Land. Examining how widows navigated space not only describes the demographic status of many of the women participating in these activities, but also highlights the interplay between individual status and aspirations and communal values, and illustrates the creation of extended spaces for women within and without the boundaries of social expectations. Different theoretical perspectives and conceptual frameworks have highlighted a number of interpretations, stimulating further study. Yishuv humanistic concepts of geography set the stage with his 1977 book entitled Space and Place as two codependent notions. But with the case at hand, we are not discussing only reciprocal perspectives, but also intersectionality, the overlapping of social identities, the multiple identities which intersect and create a whole that is different from the component individual identities. However, it is not only individual decisions or behavioral traits to be discussed here, but a part of a developing cultural norm which acknowledges, accepts, and in time comes to sanctify such behavior. The terms embedded in cultural capital overlap and enrich, even if at times conflict with these former concepts, and offer a broader conceptual framework to discuss the power play embedded in geographic mobility. Social networking theories, which I have used in the past, I've written about in the past to facilitate explanations for the resilience and the ability of women in general, and widows in particular, to cope with the challenges of changing circumstances, may be considered social capital and as such subsumed within the concepts of cultural capital. Thus, the resulting discussion may also be utilized as a basis for comparative studies, hopefully within the framework both of this conference and beyond. And for this, I thank the organizers of these 3 wonderful days for the opportunities provided, and particularly to Professor Moshe Rossman for all his efforts, and to Annabella, without which we probably wouldn't be sitting here. Bourdieu's discussions of individual and society as relational, 2 dimensions of the same social reality, ring true to the case at hand and go deeper than Tuan's codependent paradigm, thus highlighting power relationships which emerge, including the obvious critique of gender relationships. And here, I don't have time to go into the theoretical thicket of this discussion. Jewish widows took advantage of and even exploited traditional values in order to stretch the boundaries of Jewish praxis, without directly challenging them or breaking social convention. For those women devoted to Jewish traditions, their importance in ordering the rhythms of daily life and their emotional and religious significance, remolding and expanding Jewish tradition, are not only more subtle strategies for transforming behavior, but perhaps the only ones possible in order to remain within the community, both physically and spiritually. Social constraints placed upon Jewish women in Islamic countries limited their spatial boundaries and possibilities for mobility, but these constraints were often mitigated in order to fulfill the family responsibilities and religious and social obligations. For example, visiting the sick, bikor cholim, as well, and perhaps primarily, by economic necessity. Widows were in a unique position because their status allowed them greater flexibility with regard to geographic mobility. They were part of the community, yet marginalized. They had their own family, yet could interact with others on a wider scale. Widows composed a high percentage of the population of the Jewish communities in both North Africa and Palestine in the 19th century, although the phenomenon was not specific either to that period nor to the North African Jewish community. Even taking into account the hazards of childbirth, mortality rates were higher for men who worked in unprotected workplaces and often in hostile environments than for women who worked in home environments, be it their own or others. Jewish societies have traditionally encouraged remarriage in order to preserve the family unit, to promote social security, and to protect women. However, the age difference between the spouses tended to rise in second and third marriages, resulting in a demographic gender imbalance, which often precluded the possibility for remarriage for women. Widowhood, while tragic and traumatic, also presented new opportunities for women. What did you hit?
Just the other one.
Oh, the other. That's not taken out of my time, right? Widowhood, while tragic and traumatic, also presented new opportunities for women and speared new directions of activity, which may be termed as post-traumatic growth. These women who had been integrally involved in community activity via their families and held a measure of status via their husbands were marginalized almost immediately upon the death of a spouse. Though they may have enhanced status as a matriarch, they were likely to become a burden on their family or communities, both financially and socially. On the other hand, widowhood was effectively a passport to freedom, as Ruth Lamdan had originally elaborated in her study of 16th century women Jewish women in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Women who had previously been under the jurisdiction of their fathers, brothers, and husbands became legal entities in their own right, able to make their own decisions and manage their own affairs, at least theoretically, and visible in their communities and in the written records which we have to build. Such women had the possibility to develop independent life, even if this perceived independence arose from economic necessity or was circumscribed by it. The empowerment of a woman who did not belong to a man posed a danger, or at least a problem in patriarchal society. Whether rich or poor, they were required to re-examine their lives and reevaluate their future. This passport was especially valid for geographic mobility. Influenced by Muslim norms of gender segregation and appearance in public, Jewish women in general were more visible than their Muslim counterparts, although socializing was usually linked to traditional religious mitzvot, generally in the domestic private sphere. Widows were less restricted, thus able to utilize cultural resources and traditions to stretch the limits of women's spatial mobility. In Jewish society, for example, that could mean increased but sanctioned visits to the sick or presence in synagogues or cemeteries. Okay, now we're working. In her discussion of early modern Jewish women in Spain, Renee Levine Melamed noted, quote, religious devotion most certainly provided an opportunity for self-expression in a society that rarely allowed female voices to be heard, unquote. And in 19th, 20th century Morocco, this was also often expressed in pilgrimages to holy sites, and even aliyah, immigration to the Holy Land. As has been shown in other contexts by other scholars, such non-formal, non-institutional expressions of religiosity are revealing of women's spirituality and empowerment. Changes in both their personal status and geographic location allowed widows to imagine, define, and identify themselves as somehow apart from the collectivities which others had defined them. Widows form new relationships with fellow travelers, neighbors, and communal authorities. And here I hook onto what Craig Perry mentioned yesterday about the mobility of slaves, and that needs more thought as to the function of mobility here. They engaged social networks to assist the transitions and protected and preserved many of the customs and the forms of family relationships that seemed to them, and here the perception is important, to serve their interests, while resisting those that threatened their position. Women's participation in the phenomena of saint veneration became increasingly popular in the mid-19th century among North American Jews in general, and in Morocco under French colonial rule in particular. Many scholars have studied the blossoming of saint veneration and analyzed it from various perspectives, predominantly in southern and central Morocco. And here's a map, hopefully. Here's a map which gives you some idea of the clustering of these hundreds of sites. And time does not allow for a more general discussion of saint veneration here. Women as well as men, and in fact more than men, believed in the special powers of these holy men, visited the grave sites, and participated there in public celebrations. Here we have a rather orientalized, romantic style painting in 1881 from Wilhelm Gentz, and this shows the gathering at the tomb of the 14th century Spanish rabbi, the Rabash, although in Algeria, but that's what we have close enough to Morocco for this presentation. Rabbinic literature and ethnographic studies document women initiating such pilgrimages. Rabbi Chaim Massas of Meknes in Morocco even ruled in the late 19th century that a husband is obligated to take his wife to visit the graves of the righteous. Although at the same time, rabbis in Fes and Safrou had often had other reservations, somewhat similar to those heard today regarding lack of modesty and the social mixing of the sexes that we hear today about the pilgrimage and hilulot for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Meron or the Baba Sali in Netivot. Women usually traveled together as part of a group comprised mainly of women. Recalling visits in the 1930s, many interviews regale in stories of the social context of the trip, the excitement and the opportunity of an outing with other women, not usually afforded in their daily lives, complete with communal meals transformed into religious su'udot. This could be interpreted several ways. The liberating social context is what was etched in their memories, and the personal primary reason of the personal crisis or private request from the tzaddik had long been forgotten. Or the opposite, perhaps the private appeal has remained personal and private, and only the experience of the trip and the get-together has remained. Whatever the case may be, the connection between the marginality of these women, the marginality of their activities, and the physical the geographic marginality of the sites of the shrines bears further examination. A second the example here is the aliyah as a form of permanent migration as opposed to pilgrimages, which may be considered temporary or seasonal migrations. However, both are manifestations of religious and spiritual aspirations. And in light of the important links between the North African saints and Eretz Israel, both reflect a deep physical as well as emotional connection with the Holy Land. Once these practices became accepted forms of behavior and technology provided ever-improving forms of transportation, Aliyah seems to have become a realistic as well as an emotional extension of them, empowering women both geographically and spiritually. These locations also directed the women in their choice of destination in Israel. So we have from the same central southern area of Morocco going to the area of Tzfat and Tiberias, which had a much larger number of these graves. In addition to nuclear and extended families, a significant number of widows also emigrated to Eretz Israel. More than men, it seems that women, mainly widows, chose to spend their final years in the Holy Land. Although they did in fact die there, the Jews from North Africa in general do not seem to have been motivated at all by the desire to die and be buried in the Holy Land, but to live there. And the age range that we can see from an analysis of 19th century census can testify to this. Although it's not always possible to ascertain which of the women listed as widows at the time of the census arrived as such, it is still significant to note that twice as many women as men arrived in the country over the age of 60. The 1855 list of widows in the Sephardic community in Tzfat, for example, enumerates one group of some 16 widows born in the same region who all migrated 3 years previously, all in their 50s or 60s, leading to the conclusion that most, if not all, arrived as widows. The Jews in 19th century North African communities in the Holy Land, there were twice as many adult women as men, one widow for every married woman, and almost no unmarried men for the reason that I explained before. Certainly the communities were blessed with women and all the implications and challenges that encompassed. Aliyah was not only culturally acceptable, but seemed as a holy act in the eyes of the community, and every person, man and woman, became an emissary for her family and community, fulfilling not only the mitzvah of settling the land, mitzvah Yishuv haaretz on their behalf, but also those mitzvot which could only be fulfilled in Eretz Israel. The spatial mobility of women, the motivations for their long-distance migration, and the selectivity of female migrants also were determined by the relational position of women within their families and within their communities. Using gender as a variable in the study of migration has also suggested that certain categories of women are in fact selected out for migration or actually pushed out. Although older widows were the matriarchs of the family, this status must be distinguished from their often marginal functions in daily life, often inhibiting the independence of the next generation. Jewish families possibly recognized this distinction and thus accepted and often encouraged the decision of their mothers and sisters to migrate. This marginality meshed with relative autonomy, Thus they could finally fulfill their desires and dreams and migrate to Eretz Israel, sanctioned by both family and community. However, it must be added that such autonomy was also limited by their own economic resources or those made available to them by their families. So concluding, some of the transformations discussed here were specific to Jewish women in Morocco at a historical intersection of change. Others may be more broadly defined. Research focusing on gender in the study of Jewish mobility and migrations highlights the interplay between the individual aspirations and community values and the use of cultural capital to transform patterns of behavior, stretching the cultural norms. By examining aspects of Jewish widows' spatial mobility in a majority Muslim culture and in various Jewish communities, our understanding of the use of dynamic features of cultural capital to enhance personal empowerment and expand women's physical and spiritual boundaries may be enriched. Can I have 30 seconds more to connect it? I had a final paragraph, which in the interest of time, and you wouldn't have time, I cut out. Then on Sunday, Annabella sent me the itinerary for this afternoon's tour, and you have to permit me that final paragraph. Okay. So whether women migrated to the Holy Land as widows, whether they became widows after settling in the countries, the communities of the Holy Land, including Jerusalem, which we'll be walking, were blessed with a large number of women. And the communal male leadership had to contend with the needs and the demands that were thus created. The social implications of such patterns and the challenges they presented are beyond the scope of this paper. However, it seems that the same ideals and empowerment which embodied in these women and their decision to migrate continued to fortify them after their arrival and gave them the strength to cope with the severe poverty and the enormous problems in daily life in 19th century Eretz Israel, and we will be walking in some of these sites, and we have to see the difference between those that had money and those that didn't. Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor Ben Yaakov, thank you very much. Our third and last speaker for this session is Professor Margalit Shilo. Professor Shilo is a Professor Emerita from the Land of Israel Studies Department at Bar-Ilan University. Her expertise is in the history of the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, 1840 and 1948. The emphasis is on women of the Yishuv. Among her books, Princess or Prisoner, Jewish Women in Jerusalem, 1840 to 1914, and the book that was published last year, Girls of Liberty, The Struggle for Suffrage in Mandatory Palestine.
Okay. זהו? Okay, תודה. While this conference focuses on the way that Islamic culture influenced Jewish life, my paper aims at pointing out the opportunities that sprang for Jewish women in mandatory Palestine, which was not anymore an Islamic authority, when the 400 years of Islamic Ottoman rule ended. The Ottoman authorities, which had taken little interest in the lives of its population, left the country, and particularly the Yishuv, bereft of authoritative institutions. I'm extremely uncomfortable. I'll see. Hoppala. Okay, good. Okay, the Ottoman authorities, which had taken little interest in the lives of its population, left the country, and particularly the Yishuv, bereft of authoritative institutions which take care of the people's day-to-day needs. Following the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of the British Mandate, Palestine was like a desert awaiting for Jewish women and, of course, also for men to materialize their newly acquired professions and change Jewish life in the land. My paper will focus on 3 areas which went through tremendous changes due to the work of Jewish professional women: medicine, welfare, and education. The new mandatory regime, not very different from the Ottoman authorities, left these fields entirely to the Jewish community. Let me first describe the dawn of female higher academic education. Professionalism of women was made possible thanks to the revolution that occurred in women's education, whereby women began to be accepted into the university. According to Harriet Pass Friedenreich, university education transformed womanhood, especially Jewish womanhood, in the 20th century. Friedenreich described the exceptional influx of women in Europe, especially Jewish women, to the universities. This desire for higher education was shared also by a significant number of young men and women of the Yishuv who went to study abroad and came back. The professional activities of women were a breakthrough, a pioneering act, not only in professional and nationalistic terms, but first and foremost in terms of gender. In addition to a university education, many women took after high school non-academic vocational courses in areas such as preschool education, social work, dance, and the arts. Social work was a new vocational area. Only in 1925, this area of study was recognized as an academic track. To the small number of professional women who arrived already before World War I in Ottoman Palestine, many hundreds of young educated Zionist women were added in the 3 decades of the mandatory period. They wished to fulfill their professional and nationalistic aspirations upon their immigration to Eretz Israel. Although still an underdeveloped region, Jewish women considered Palestine a coveted destination. Rare interviews and memoirs written by women path breakers in a variety of fields document these young women's hopes to work in the areas they had chosen and at the same time to improve the lives of all the people living in the land. Jewish women doctors, members of the first, second, and third generation of academic women, headed to Eretz Israel. If you had already arrived towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, as described by Dr. Batsheva Yunis Gutman, who immigrated in 1909, we were just a handful of doctors. רגע, הזזתי. אמרתי שאני בא כאן. אוקיי, זה פרידנרייך. אוקיי. Dr. Batsheva Yunis Gutman, who immigrated in 1909, we were just a handful of doctors, but we had dreams of great plans, of doing great things. Dr. Alexandra Belkin, who enrolled in medical school in 1898, admitted that she had chosen medicine in order to protect the health of the people of Eretz Israel, who suffered from many diseases and a high rate of infant mortality. The men and women doctors that arrived, especially those who came before the Nazis rose to power, did so out of a desire not only to fulfill their ambition to heal the ill, but also out of a desire to be a part of the fulfillment of the Zionist vision. And in the words of Dr. Eunice Gutman, we were all young, filled with energy, hope, and a great faith in the future of our country, and were prepared to use all our energy and knowledge for the benefit of our endeavor. These feelings were shared, for example, by the first woman architect in Palestine, Lotte Cohen, who immigrated to Eretz Israel in 1921, wrote, "I was young, but we were all the more aware of our responsibility since we were the beginning. We were a small group of young people who arrived here thanks to our passion and enthusiasm, and also because we loved adventure. A calling fell into our hands to build the land. The personal launch was sustained by the national spirit." Medicine. Before discussing women's medical achievements, I want to point out the fact that the percentage of women among doctors in pre-state Israel was unusually high. In 1929 to 1932, it was 30%, unparalleled of. After the Nazis came to power, an upheaval that led to the dismissal of Jewish physicians from Germany, both men and women, an influx of hundreds of them arrived in mandatory Palestine. And in the 3 decades of the mandatory regime, the British issued about 3,600 permits to Jewish physicians, of which about 20%, 720, went to women. Such a high proportion of female physicians was unprecedented. Nissim Levy and Yael Levy, historians of medicine in Israel, devoted special attention to the work of the women doctors, noting that these women were a special breed. Upon arrival in the country, they contended successfully with the absorption difficulties, agreed to practice far from the center of the country, live in difficult housing and weather conditions, were willing to get around on animals, and content with a great deal of work. Indeed, the Zionist vision and economic necessity forged these strong, liberated women with a prestigious profession. Although they did not engage, רגע, I see I forgot Lotte Cohen, no, I went, רגע, okay, טוב. Although they did not engage in agriculture, but rather cared for the health of the country's people, they were considered pioneers. I will now present one example of the work of one of the women doctors, Dr. Helena Kagan, who, unwilling to make do with focusing only on her medical work, pediatrics, also sought to educate the entire community, especially its women, to engage in healthful lifestyle. The pinnacle of her achievements was her public community work, the education of mothers to maintain hygiene in order to safeguard the lives of their children, and to instill the values of a healthy lifestyle in view of the wretched hygienic standards that prevailed in the city and then until then endangered a very short lifespan. Preventive medicine was the approach underlying a wide variety of Kagan's initiatives. She contributed a great deal to the Well Mother clinics founded by the Hebrew Women's Organization, Histadrut Nashim Ivriot, and Hadassah. In an interview I held with her in 1972, yes, I did it, as a student, she admitted, it's difficult to describe what I didn't do. Helena Kagan put all her energy into her work, creating a new model of the Hebrew women, alongside the woman worker who sought to shed her femininity and the bourgeois woman who viewed motherhood as the primary national goal for women. Were professional women who considered their professional work to be their national mission. Most of them, Kagan excluded, also raised their private families. Welfare. Henrietta Sold, who founded and headed the Hadassah Women's Organization in New York in 1912, headed since 1931 the first national local welfare department of the Yishuv. Sold, who was not a professional social worker, arrived in 1920 in Jerusalem and shaped the perception of the Yishuv concerning its responsibility for its citizens' welfare, contrary to the socialist approach that prevailed among the labor movement that led the Yishuv regarding the supreme importance of its economy and its labor sector and agriculture to the endeavor of building the country. In her view, social work is no less productive than the economy, farming the land, trade, and industry. She considered concern for all citizens to be a major element in nation building, a process that included the building of the individual. The crisis that occurred in the Yishuv in wake of the arrival of the fourth Aliyah between 1924 and 1926-7 contributed a great deal to the recognition of the importance of caring for every citizen. This approach is expressed to this day in the wording of the law that applies to social workers in Israel. It states that their goal is to improve the personal and social functioning of the individual and community. An impressive number of social workers, most of them women who studied the field in Germany, were her collaborators. One example, Sidi Varonsky, there you go, okay, a renowned social worker who was dismissed from her job when the Nazis came to power, emigrated from Germany to Eretz Israel in 1933. Varonsky viewed her profession as the primary means to improve the absorption of the arriving immigrants and to guarantee that the Yishuv draw maximum benefit from them. Sold and the social workers laid the foundation for welfare services during the Yishuv period. They were imbued with a deep Jewish awareness and devotion to the Zionist idea. Researcher Tova Golan offers an eloquent articulation explaining women's ability to introduce new concepts in the Yishuv society. Paradoxically, the very fact that they, the social workers, belonged to the half of the population that was discriminated against and that was excluded from the important Zionist work, that is, that they were women, enabled them to make these conceptual changes. Perhaps it was their dual marginality, both as women in a patriarchal society and as those working in a women's area remote from the agenda of the labor movement, that enabled them to enter through the back door and gradually introduce the values and practices of the importance of social work in an immigrant society. Education. Since I have only very short time, I'll sum up that at that period, most teachers were male in the Hebrew educational field, but there were two areas. The kindergarten, which is a very well-known field, which was run completely or nearly completely by women, and special education, which I will say a few words about it. The idea that the schools here lack special education was known, and the first person who was able to help in this respect was a woman, and I'll introduce her in a minute. There you go. This is, okay, there we go. Shoshana Persitz, a young widow of 32 who had immigrated to Eretz Israel in 1925, together with her 4 children, assumed responsibility for the new initiative. Brachiahu, who originally had the idea, appealed to Persitz in the following words: "We have no one other than you in Eretz Israel who can actualize the concept and move it from theory to practice." The city of Tel Aviv and the Department of Education that she headed was the first to participate in the cost of its children's education, including those in need of special education. Persitz placed at them a new building and the funding. The educator, Mina Groman, who studied special education in Vienna, was invited to serve as the principal of the new school, Netzach Israel, which became the flagship of special education in the country. The school became the guiding light for all those involved in the field. Groman's success paved the way for the recognition that children perceived as damaged were also entitled to an education and training in preparation for their adult lives. The teachers of Netzach Israel were considered to be pioneers, like female doctors and social workers. They were sensitive to human suffering and imbued with a great deal of optimism. Persitz's approach came to the fore when, after the establishment of the state, she served as the chair of the Knesset Education Committee, and in 1949 the Knesset passed the compulsory education law that determined that education was compulsory for all children in the country. I'm finishing. Paradoxically, the absence of modern institutions in the Jewish community in mandatory Palestine became an advantage for professional women. A comparison of the trajectory of women's professional advancement in the Yishuv to their sisters in Central Europe and the United States shows that in many senses they were quite different. Those women that lived in rich and developed countries were marginalized not only because they were women, but also because they were Jewish. To the gender discrimination that was rife everywhere was added religious, ethnic discrimination, which was non-existent in Eretz Israel. The only profession that was closed to women until 1930 was the law, since it was under the British jurisdiction. The British authorities catered to the Muslim population, which negated the idea of women lawyers.
Thank you all for your excellent presentations. Professor Schwarzwald. Let's open up the floor for a question and answer session or discussion.
Stand up, please.
I teach at the Rodrigue International School of Hebrew University. I have a question for Professor Schwarzwald about the Seder Nashim. You mentioned, it's interesting that you mentioned they're both printed in Venice, both of his works.
No. Seder Nashim, there is a unique one copy in the National Hebrew Library here, and that's it.
But where
And
was it
I-
printed?
It was printed in Salonika.
In Salonika. Okay. So my question to you was there any influence on his work by the books for women that were being printed in Venice at that time?
Okay. Shulḥan. Take questions first and then I come back. This is
Stand up, please.
This is mainly for Michal. And the question of how a woman can remain inside a traditional context using its resources to expand is one that is cross-cultural. And I'm struck by how much the American case, though much earlier, is reiterated in the later Jewish cases, with regard also to education. So there is an argument in historiography as to whether drawing on traditional resources and also education that is rooted in tradition or is framed through traditional needs really does allow for an expansion or limits the expansion. That is, whether the conservative roots and frame of education also, just to educate women as mothers, for example, or drawing on these roles, ultimately limits how far women's progressive lives can go, or whether these conservative bases can't be controlled by conservative impulses, but in fact, nevertheless, propel progressive outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Another question? Ms. Shahar?
Is that also a question for Michal? I'm just wondering, when the Jewish women decide to go on their road trips to the different sites, how did they determine the times of year that they would go? And in addition, what did they do with their families?
Okay, let's start answering, then we'll take some other questions. Okay?
Okay. As I said before, Seder Nashim was published only once, and there were no reprints of the book, and there were no other prayer books for women published as books. I must admit that there is a manuscript of a Ladino manuscript of Sidur Nashim, which was published, which Lazar published it, and he wrote that it was from before the expulsion from Spain, but Minervini and I showed separately that it couldn't have been published in Spain. I mean, all the linguistic material cannot have occurred in Spain. It was published, I found that it was published in Italy. It was written, it was not published. It was written in Italy and probably in Venice. And it's handwritten. It was not published as a book. Shulḥan Hapanim was published again. Shulḥan Hapanim, which is the translation of Shulchan Aruch, was published again in Venice twice, in 1602 and in 1713. That's it. By the way, the Seder Nashim, I published it. It appeared in Ben Tzvi Institute. I transcribed the whole text and translated it into Hebrew so that everybody can see what the prayers are basically the same, although it's condensed, as I said before. Not all the prayers appear there. For instance, in Birkat Hamazon, which is a regular text, the sentence that refers to Al Britcha shechatamta bivsarenu ve'al toratcha shelimadetanu is erased. I mean, it doesn't appear there because women shouldn't say that. I mean, Al Britcha shechatamta bivsarenu. And in Birkot HaShachar appear, but the Tfilot HaAmidah includes only the 18, only 18. No Birkot HaShachar, and not Psukei de Zimra, not all the additions that men say, for instance. Okay. Your question about the traditional sources limiting the boundaries, I mean, that's on the one hand acceptable, which is why I use the expression of stretching the boundaries or expanding the boundaries, because these women weren't interested in breaking the boundaries. They would be, they weren't interested in leaving tradition. So you're right, it did have many constricting factors, but on the other hand, the boundaries kept being pushed and pushed. So, as I said, they were first accepted and then encouraged and then sanctified. So it was still very much remaining within tradition to see as far as they can go. Now, in the case presented here, in the limited time that I have, I didn't deal with education at all. But I can take a parallel situation from another project that I did on religious Zionist education in mandatory Palestine. And I did tens of interviews with these women who studied in the 1920s and the 1930s, and one of them turned around to me and says, "You're asking feminist questions." We weren't feminists, but of course she was one of the few women that went to
outlying settlement. She was the first woman who was a general supervisor, the first woman who was in charge of the veil, woman that went to the DP camp. But she wasn't a feminist, and she very much objected to the kind of questions that I was asking. So therefore, it's a case that's 50 years later than what I'm talking about in general. But it's still, we're talking about stretching the boundaries and being very careful not to break the boundaries, which is, a different kind of empowerment, but it's still empowerment in my opinion. In terms of the timing of these trips, many of them, as I mentioned, they were in marginal peripheral areas, but if you could see by the map that I showed, there were hundreds of them. So very often they were outside towns and villages so that they could go on a one-day trip. So that made things easier because it was a one-day trip. Now, that also small children went with them. Okay, so if I'm talking about widows, generally the children were older. And when they're also with younger women, they took their windows. I mean, like I spoke to one woman, she was saying, oh, I remember we used to go, the women would, this is in the 1930s, so they were already going by these trucks that had these benches that come down. I said, oh, we used to go behind the skirts and we would go under the bench back and forth behind the skirts of these women, so they clearly took their younger children with them. Now, in terms of the timing, there were a couple of factors. First of all, there would be the big Hilulam, the anniversary of the death of the saint, which would be a much larger thing, so there must be more organized transportation. Sometimes women did go either individually, not totally individually, they're with their husbands or with a couple of other women. Rosh Chodesh would be a time where women would go, or women would go when they felt that they had a particular need, like a barren woman or a woman who, not too near when she was going to give birth, but when she was pregnant or something like this. So aside from the Hilula, which is similar and different, which is stretching it more than just the regular timing, sort of like when it was needed and when it was worked out and when they could organize with some other women and transportation, etc.
Just one sentence for stretching the boundaries. I did research on widows who came also from Eastern Europe and elsewhere. There's one exception that was not looked upon favorably, and this was when unmarried women had decided to come on their own. The most prominent is Habtula Miludmir, and this was not looked favorably upon.
Which just reinforces the point about widows, because they were single women, but they weren't unmarried. I mean, they had been married.
social workers in the Yishuv, because in the Yishuv all this main figure and no one knows the real social workers that female that are behind her. And I wanted to ask regarding all of these women treatment or attitude towards the Arabic population at the time.
Okay, thank you. Yaron?
I have a question or comment.
Stand up, please.
Oh, that's I have a question or comment. For Ora, I was surprised to hear you quoting Rabbi Ben-Benishti, a recommendation to fathers to teach the daughters not only to read, but to write as well. But as far as I know, until the opening of modern Jewish schools in the Middle East, even boys never learned to write. What for? There were some Torah scholars who wrote contracts, Gittin, and so was it
question. As you probably know, if the question was medical help, this was given and this was guided by Henrietta Sold, and even before, medicine was geared, Jewish medicine was geared to Jews and Eretz alike, and even some rare though women physicians had worked only in Arab neighborhoods, so like in Jericho and some other places. But concerning social work, now social work was funded by the Zionist movement, and this was actually geared for the Jewish population. Had they also treated Arabs? So far, I think you should know better than I.
Okay. About writing, he specifies that learning to read is more important, but he mentions also solitrear. And solitrear is the handwritten version of the script, the Rashi script. That's for your question. And for a fact, I know that women at the end of the 19th, pardon? No. Trear. For reading. Yeah, it's for reading. Yeah, I correct myself. As for the Siddur, thank you. I haven't seen it, but I'm sure it's entirely different in its traditional translation of the prayers. It must be entirely different in the translation of the prayers than the tradition that is found in the two previous books, which are real Ladino, namely very literal translation, word for word. What else did you ask? The proportion. The first parts are more detailed than the last ones. That's one thing. And I couldn't explain all the principles that he mentions in the. He included all the laws that are relevant for the people. Laws that the people might ridicule, I do not include. Namely, there are certain rules that the people won't do, and he just ignored them. So in many cases, you see that he follows the order of the chapters and the subsections in each part. And you'll see that all of a sudden it's Shin Kaf Bet, Shin Kaf Gimel, Shin Kaf Daled together. I mean, and then Shin Mem something. He skips many laws that are mentioned in Shulchan Aruch. Yeah. Yes, he's skipping them consciously because he thinks only the relevant laws that the public may follow, he brings them into the translation.
Yes, last sentence, the mandatory. The authorities, they were funding the Arab population, they were not funding the Jewish population because they said the Jews take care of themselves. So they did get help, but mainly from mandatory authorities and if they were voluntary Jewish organizations.
And just to add to that, they also got aid from Christian philanthropic organizations. So different systems.